In the summer of 2009, a Mexican government research vessel dropped anchor in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico, pointed its sonar directly at the ocean floor below, and found absolutely nothing. No rock. No reef. No shallow ridge. No remnant of anything that had ever been above the surface. Just 4,000 feet of open water over sediment that, according to their instruments, had sat undisturbed for at least 5,000 years. That should not have surprised anyone. Except for one problem. At those exact coordinates, 22 degrees, 33 minutes north, 91 degrees, 22 minutes west, an island had appeared on official maps for 480 years. It had a name. Isla Bermeja. It had a color, reddish blonde, according to the Spanish sailors who first described it. It had a size, roughly 80 square kilometers. It had appeared in the atlas of every major maritime power, survived 2 world wars worth of cartographic revisions, made it into Mexican school textbooks, and as recently as the 1940s was being cited in government documents as the northernmost point of Mexican territory in the Gulf of Mexico. The island was the legal anchor from which Mexico calculated the boundary of its exclusive economic zone, the 200 nautical mile ring of ocean where it held sovereign rights over everything below the surface, including the oil. And according to the scientists who surveyed the seafloor in 2009, the island had never existed. Not once. Not ever. The sediment at the bottom of that patch of ocean had never been disturbed by a landmass sitting on top of it. Which raises a question that no one has been able to fully answer to this day. If that island was never real, then how did it end up quietly costing Mexico the rights to 22.5 billion barrels of oil? To understand how a phantom can bankrupt a nation, you have to go back to 1539, to a Spanish cartographer working in a world where most of the oceans were still a matter of educated guesswork. His name was Alonso de Santa Cruz, and he was compiling something ambitious, a complete atlas of every island in the known world, titled Islario General de Todas las Islas del Mundo, the General Atlas of all the islands of the world. The Gulf of Mexico was barely 2 decades into European exploration. Santa Cruz had never personally been there. He was working from the reports of sailors, pilots, and explorers who had sailed those waters, men whose tools for determining position were a compass, a rough estimate of speed, and the elapsed time since they last knew where they were. The technical term is dead reckoning. The practical result, in ocean waters where currents could push a vessel by miles without the crew knowing, was that islands sometimes ended up on maps in places they did not occupy, or more rarely, in places where no island existed at all. In 1539, Santa Cruz placed a small, low-lying, reddish-blonde island off the north coast of the Yucatan Peninsula. He called it Bermeja, from the Spanish Bermejo, meaning reddish, russet, the color the island appeared from a distance. A year later, in 1540, another Spanish cosmographer named Alonso de Chavez gave the island a precise location in a navigational guide called Espejo de Navegants. He described it in careful detail, its bearing from the Cape of San Anton, its distance from the Alarcranes reefs in leagues, its appearance on approach. Someone, at some point, had apparently seen something there. Or believed they had. Or copied a chart that said someone else had. That is the quiet thing that happens with cartographic errors in the age of sail. Once a feature appears in a respected source, every mapmaker who comes after it copies it. To omit an island that appeared in the previous atlas is to imply you've checked and found nothing, which requires an expedition. Expeditions cost money. The safer move, professionally speaking, is to copy what's already there and add your own improvements elsewhere. And so Bermeja propagated across 4 centuries of maps the way a rumor propagates through a crowd, not by anyone individually verifying it, but by everyone assuming someone else already had. It appeared on Dutch maps, Spanish military charts, English Admiralty surveys. American maps from the 19th century showed it clearly. Henry Tanner's 1846 map of Mexico, produced for the United States market, has it sitting right there in the Gulf, labeled and precise. The 1921 Geographic Atlas of the Mexican Republic included it. As late as 1941, Bermeja was appearing in official Mexican cartographic publications. For 408 decades of independent cross-referencing by some of the most sophisticated mapping agencies in the world, it endured. Nobody noticed the problem until there was money on the line. Here is where the story shifts from cartographic curiosity to something considerably more consequential. In 1982, the United Nations formalized a framework that had been building for years, the Law of the Sea Convention. Under its rules, every coastal nation gains an exclusive economic zone extending 200 nautical miles from its land territory. Within that zone, the country has sovereign rights over every natural resource, fish, minerals, and most critically, oil and gas. The zone isn't measured from the coastline, it's measured from the outermost points of a country's territory, including remote islands. For Mexico, Bermeja was the outermost point. Low-lying, uninhabited, roughly 110 kilometers northeast of the Yucatan coast, and, more importantly, sitting nearly 200 kilometers further north into the Gulf than anything else Mexico claimed. If Bermeja was real, Mexico's EEZ reached deep into a part of the Gulf known to sit above some of the richest untapped petroleum deposits in the Western Hemisphere. The area directly relevant here, a patch of international waters called the Hoyos de Dona, or the Donut Holes, was believed by geological surveys to contain reserves on the order of 22.5 billion barrels. Without Bermeja, the boundary sat further south. Without Bermeja, that oil fell into the contested zone where the United States could advance its own claims. The 1978 Treaty of Maritime Limits between the United States and Mexico had drawn a provisional boundary using equidistant points between known islands on both sides. The relevant American anchor was the Isles Derniers off Louisiana. The Mexican anchor, at the time, was the Alacranes Islands. But as oil exploration intensified and both countries' interest in the donut holes sharpened in the 1990s, renegotiation talks began, and in those talks, Bermeja came up. Mexico had been citing it in its maritime boundary calculations for years. Its legal position depended on the island being real. In 1997, as negotiations approached a critical juncture, a Mexican survey vessel was dispatched to the coordinates where Bermeja had always appeared on the charts. They found open water. The crew, presumably stunned, reported the finding. The government, presumably alarmed, did what governments often do with inconvenient data. They proceeded with the negotiations anyway, signed a revised treaty that year dividing the donut holes, and quietly deferred the island question. Then in 2008, the moratorium on drilling in the donut holes that had been part of that treaty was set to expire. Both governments began serious discussions about exploitation rights. And Bermeja, or its absence, became impossible to keep ignoring. The Mexican Chamber of Deputies commissioned the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM, to settle the question once and for all. This was not a small operation. The 2009 expedition aboard the research vessel Sierra deployed sonar equipment, aerial surveys, and geological analysis across more than 10,000 kilometers of ocean surface in and around the island's supposed location. Every square meter of seafloor in the search area was documented. 933 photographs of the ocean floor were taken. Sediment samples were retrieved and analyzed. The conclusion, delivered formally to the Mexican Congress, was unequivocal. The seafloor at coordinates 22 degrees, 33 minutes north, 91 degrees, 22 minutes west showed no evidence that an island had ever existed there. No underwater plateau. No submerged ridge. No geological feature that would account for a landmass. The sediment analysis went further still. According to the reported findings, the seafloor at that location showed no disruption consistent with a surface landmass for at least 5,300 years. In 2009, Mexico formally removed Bermeja Island from its official maritime charts. So what happened? The theories break into roughly 4 categories, and not one of them is entirely satisfying. The first is the simplest: Bermeja never existed. It was a cartographic error, born from dead reckoning by a 16th-century pilot who misidentified a reef, a cloud bank, or a pumice raft from an underwater volcanic event, all of which, in the right light and at the right distance, can be mistaken for a low-lying sandy island on the horizon. The error entered Santa Cruz's atlas, and from there it was faithfully reproduced for 4 centuries by cartographers who assumed the original sighting had been verified. This is the explanation that UNAM's findings most directly support. If the seafloor shows no evidence of a geological formation for over 5 millennia, there was nothing there to erode, sink, or disappear. It was never there. Geographer and island specialist Jesus Israel Bashi Martinez, who consulted on the search, described it plainly as simply a cartographic error replicated and unverified over more than 400 years. The second theory involves sea level rise and tectonic activity. Sea levels have been rising incrementally since the end of the last ice age. Low-lying atolls and sandy islets are particularly vulnerable. Several in the Pacific have disappeared within living memory. It is conceivable that Bermeja was a genuine but extremely low-lying formation that was gradually inundated over centuries, leaving no dramatic geological trace. But here the UNAM data poses a problem. The sediment analysis showed no indication the seafloor had ever supported a landmass in thousands of years. A natural disappearance through inundation would almost certainly leave some residual formation on the ocean floor. The sea level theory cannot be ruled out entirely, but it doesn't fit the evidence. The third theory is stranger and more interesting. Some researchers have raised the possibility that Bermeja was a deliberate fictitious entry, what cartographers sometimes called a trap island, placed on a map intentionally to catch rivals who copied charts without permission. Unauthorized copying of a map would reproduce the invented feature, revealing the plagiarist. The practice is well documented in the history of cartography, even appearing in the modern era when map publishers embedded fake towns and roads as copyright traps. If Bermeja was a trap, it was the most consequential copyright trick in the history of international law, a piece of legal fiction that quietly shaped a sovereign nation's territorial claims for nearly 5 centuries. The fourth theory is the one that caught fire in Mexico in 2009 and has never entirely gone away. Some theorists, including voices within Mexican fishing communities along the Yucatan coast, propose that Bermeja did once exist, that the United States was aware of its geopolitical value, and that American intelligence, specifically, the CIA, had arranged for the island to be destroyed, covertly. Precisely because its existence would have handed Mexico a legal right to a portion of the donut holes that American oil interests preferred to keep in play. The island, in this version of events, was not a phantom. It was a victim. The UNAM report's own findings make this theory extremely difficult to sustain. You cannot destroy 5,000 years of geological non-evidence. If the seafloor shows no trace of a landmass going back millennia, there was no island to destroy in the first place. And the logistics of covertly demolishing an 80-square-kilometer island without leaving a geological trace, or, for that matter, without anyone noticing, strain credulity. UNAM researchers said as much directly. But the theory persists, partly because the alternative, that 4.5 centuries of official cartography were wrong about a piece of sovereign territory that shaped oil negotiations between 2 major nations, is not a particularly comfortable truth either. What is striking about Bermeja, when you pull back from the specific conspiracy debates, is what it reveals about the infrastructure of international law. The entire geopolitical architecture of borders, maritime rights, and resource ownership is built on maps. Maps are assumed to be ground truth. Nations cite them in treaties. Courts reference them in rulings. Billions of dollars of economic claims flow from the lines drawn on them. And yet the map's authority has always rested, ultimately, on whether someone once looked out from the deck of a ship and wrote something down, and whether the people who came afterward trusted that note enough to copy it without checking. Sandy Island in the South Pacific, charted by a whaling ship in 1876, confirmed on British Admiralty charts in 1908, still appearing on Google Maps and in the Times Atlas of the World as recently as 2012, was only formally undiscovered when a University of Sydney research team aboard the Southern Surveyor sailed to its coordinates during a seabed mapping expedition and found open ocean 4,300 feet deep. The island was the size of Manhattan. It had fooled the digital mapping databases of the 21st century. It took a ship physically going there to prove it was nothing. Both Sandy Island and Bermeja are gone from the maps now. But the question they leave behind is quiet and persistent. We assume the map is the territory. We assume that because something appears in an authoritative source, it was checked, it was confirmed, someone went there and came back with evidence. The history of Phantom Islands is a long, patient demonstration that this assumption is wrong, that authority propagates by being cited, not by being verified, and that the more prestigious the source, the more faithfully the error is copied downstream. In the case of Bermeja, the stakes were not abstract. Mexico lost the legal basis for claiming a maritime zone believed to hold tens of billions of dollars in petroleum reserves. The loss was not from military defeat, not from a court ruling against them, not from a negotiated compromise. It was from the discovery that the piece of land they had been referencing in boundary calculations for generations simply wasn't there. Their claim evaporated because the ground beneath it, literally, did not exist. There are coordinates in the Gulf of Mexico, at 22 degrees 33 minutes north, 91 degrees 22 minutes west, where you can take a boat, lower your instruments, and confirm that the ocean floor shows 5,000 years of uninterrupted nothingness. What you cannot confirm, what no expedition has settled, is where the line on the map came from in the first place. The Guinness World Records once named Bermeja the longest-lived Phantom Island, acknowledged on charts for 382 years. A dubious honor. The island existed on paper long enough to matter, to anchor treaties, inform school textbooks, and form the legal bedrock of a nation's economic claims. Then the paper ran out of places to hide. It is the oldest kind of ghost story. Not a spirit that haunts a house, but a mistake that haunts a map, and through the map, haunts the world that built its borders around it.